and welcome to Sounding Board, a community access television production of Seroptimus International of Novato. My name is Madalienne Peters, and I'm the moderator for today's program with my guests, Dr. Mohammed Majdoubi and Dr. Suresh Appavoo. And the title of the discussion today is The Impact of Anxiety on Student Learning. But before we start our conversation, I would just like to remind our audience about the mission of Seroptimus. Seroptimus International's mission is improving the lives of women and girls through programs leading to social and economic empowerment. Well, thank you very much, Mohammed and Suresh, for taking the time to be here. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and to have a conversation among the three of us together is really unique, so thank you very much. I'd like you to give our audience a little bit of your background, and then we can just go ahead and have our discussion on the impact of anxiety, which is a timely topic given the research that's been coming out and published in various places. So, Mohammed, let me start with you.
Well, Madeleine, thank you very much for inviting us. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And as you said, with such a beautiful accent, my name is Mohammed Majdoubi. I am a professor of neuroscience at Dominican University of California, here in San Rafael. I have a PhD in neuroscience and pharmacology from the University of Bordeaux in France, where I studied after growing up in Morocco. So I live in San Rafael, and I have three little kids, which made the topic of anxiety and learning a very important and very close to home, because I remember my kids Nina, the oldest, had refused to attend school, and she felt always that that's not her place, and she had this separation and anxiety about it for a year. Mm-hmm. And so I always was thinking about, how much is she going to learn in school after doing all this anxiety, and that's what started the whole.
So that's what led you to the
conversation with Suresh,
and then it goes on
in a cafeteria. That started the whole project, I guess.
I think I've been part of those exploratory conversations
Exactly.
too. Thank you. Suresh, a little bit of your background.
My name is Suresh Appavoo. I'm originally from India, and I started at Dominican University of California in 2001. I am the Dean for Diversity and Equity and an Associate Professor in the School of Education, and I work with Dr. Peters, who is also a colleague of mine, and Dr. Majdoubi, who I have known since he started at Dominican. And the whole project really started as most research does, I presume, over bad food at the cafeteria. And
did that contribute to your anxiety?
Well, the reason for why I say bad, largely because the conversation began about dopamine and then cortisol. And Mohammed is probably in a much more learned position to talk about those two particular hormones, should I say, or chemicals?
Yeah, hormones. As long as they're secreted in the blood, they're
right.
called hormones.
Right,
yes.
and so that's what kicked off the whole project when we started talking about it. During the course of which I asked Mohammed this question because of his particular vantage point and research in neuroscience. I asked the question, well, what is the point at which stress and anxiety, which is necessary for learning to a certain extent, what is the point at which it deters or impedes learning? And so then Mohammed started to talk about how that works and how that happens, and perhaps you should explain a little bit further to lay people in neuroscience like me.
It would be my pleasure. This is kind of the discussions we have around lunch at Dominican. So
I think I'm joining you for lunch.
I bring in my little stories about my kids, and then we talk about it, and then we get into the neuroscience of things. To talk about stress, stress has always this negative connotation to it, that it's always bad. Actually, stress, short-term stress is very important, what we call the fight or flight, as long as it stays under control. And so for a very short term, it increases the blood flow to the brain, it increases the depth and rate of breathing. We actually perceive the world faster, which is good to be able to do that. That's the survival. That's what an instinct of the human brain is made for.
That alertness is really helpful as in the learning process as individuals, take in information.
It's the excitement. It gets you ready. It gets your whole body ready. That's the excitement about it. That's what an athlete needs before they compete. And if you come in sleepy in a classroom, definitely the learning is not going to happen. So, so it's not that bad. And that's what adrenaline does. So it makes you ready. The problem is if it goes beyond that short term, it becomes a problem. And so studies have shown that achievement, for instance, with short-term stress is very high in both physically and intellectually. But as long as we stay in that mode of stress, the capacity to think and to do things goes down. So in terms of production, both intellectually and physical, becomes a problem. And that's now we're talking about cortisol, which is a different hormone. And cortisol is usually linked to a lack of psychological well-being. And it has been correlated with basically, and statistically, with bad performance in terms of learning, retention, and engagement of students don't get very engaged in the classroom because of that. And that's what comes to mind when we were talking with Suresh is really when we test students in a setting where they are anxious. A lot of them are anxious about
the
exams.
situation, right?
So we are at the level where, when we're adult, this is how it works. You go to the classroom, and we're talking about college students at this point. You are stressed out before you see the exam, right? That's the initial one. You're waiting. You're shaking. As soon as you get the exam, you look at it and you can see that things are under control, and suddenly your stress level goes down. So you just got prepared.
Right.
And you can actually go on in a great performance at that point.
So your stress level, when you realize, it's like the person realizes, I could do this.
Yes.
I know something. In this exam or in
Okay.
this test or in this particular context or in this particular situation. Once you know something, then your cortisol starts to decrease, slowly over time, because now you're feeling more comfortable. You're moving away from the fight or flight possibility.
And so that's where that short term, that was good, wake you up.
Yes, it
And
sort
so
of gets you prepared and
Get
attentive.
you prepared for
Yeah.
the exam. You'll do probably well as long as you're studied. The problem is, imagine someone who actually got stressed, looked at the exam, and stayed within that stress,
Yes.
the initial stress. It becomes actually a long-term stress, and at that point, when we're stressed out, what we need to know is that we are under the control of an area of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is the one that creates the fear and rage. And it's very important for our survival. That's the one that tells you something is dangerous, you need to get out of it. Mm-hmm. But that part is called the reptilian brain. And it's probably the least smart part of the brain, and it hijacks the whole system. So when you are in a stressful situation, you're actually dealing with the world as reptilian. And we have
a real basic level of
survival.
Okay.
The one that deals usually with food and how to keep myself alive.
Yeah.
And it's actually hijacked so much that one cannot kill themselves without using an instrument, because you don't even have that ability to choke yourself to death. So imagine that
that level of rage is so, yeah.
You basically cannot do anything to your body, because now your reptilian brain is taking, and it's an instinct that even your will, what we think is a free will, does not apply at that level.
Oh my goodness.
But the problem is, when you're under the reptilian brain, well, you perform like a reptilian. We have yet to find a PhD candidate that actually a lizard or a snake. And so when you take a performance exam and you're anxious, you're basically a little lizard trying to figure out
To survive.
how to survive, and probably you would try to finish that exam as soon as possible, because that's actually a threatening situation, and that's where you see someone finishing an exam in 10 minutes and you look at the exam and it's empty. They just want to get out of there.
It's it's such an uncomfortable place to be that they just want to finish or just get out.
That's what their brain
hand in
does.
the test and leave.
They fight until the point of where they realize, okay, flight is a better option. And so the quicker we can exit from this particular context, the better off our chances of survival are going to be.
I see.
And so where the intersection happened really was, since our field is education, I began to think about, well, given the cultural history in the United States, where most Americans are essentially very obsessed with testing.
Yes.
And in particular, the regime of standardized testing and high-stakes exams for virtually every level, at every level of education. What does that actually do? Does that actually capture the learning that happens for the kids, K through 12? Is it really the best way to determine what people are actually learning by putting them into these sort of high anxiety, high stress contexts? And is that really the best way to approach it in terms of teaching and learning? So my sort of question really in terms of the research process was to find out, well, how do we find out actual stress levels? And largely because, you know, most students, if you go through a self-reporting process, generally will say, oh yeah, I was a little bit stressed or I was not stressed. It's very kind of opaque, if you will. And so immediately Mohammed said, you know, there is a way to actually check this. And I said, a physiological test? And he said, yeah, a non-intrusive physiological process that could actually happen. And perhaps, Mohammed, you can speak to how that particular construction came about.
And so this is what, based on the biology of things. So far, stress was tested in a way that you ask the subject how stressed out they are, how emotionally they feel. And so it's a self-perceived kind of stress that they report. The problem is there is always a bias to it. Some people feel more stressed than they are, and some people feel less stressed than they should be. And so when you get those kind of reports, it's basically a biased report. Now there is a technology that measures the level of cortisol in the saliva. So what the project that we thought about was, since there is a kit that can measure the level of cortisol, why don't we put together both their self-perceived stress as they are answering questions about their well-being, and at the same time they could be just chewing on a cotton swab that in their mouth for like a couple of minutes, and that saliva that's collected by the cotton can actually be measured, and it can tell you the level of cortisol in the blood. And so it gives you a physiological index now that's unbiased.
So you have the self-report, and then, as you said, you have the physiological index that's in the saliva to analyze, to compare levels of stress, or to discuss and understand levels of stress, perceived and actually from the saliva test.
Yes.
Am I right?
Exactly. So it gives you another biological element that adds to the perceived stress. And if you do this during an exam, for instance, you can also measure the retention. You can measure several things that's related to the exam. How the student did in terms of anxiety. And you can correlate the anxiety, both psychological, physiological, together with the learning and how well they did in an exam or not. And so that's how we started this. And we got in touch with colleagues from the Department of Psychology, Suresh and his students from the School of Education. I had students that were in my class in the Department of Sciences. And so we create this multidisciplinary team in which we carried on an initial project to study classes, actually undergraduate students at the college level in Dominican, with different types of exams. One an open note, another one was closed book. And in a way that we were able to measure how they feel with different exams and which one trigger more anxiety and which one is the best for them to actually express and show what they have learned. And so the study was done at the adult level, and so what we would like to do with this is to try and use it in a K-12 setting. And so because it's not very invasive, the technique can be used with children.
Exactly.
They
It's
just
a very
chew on
simple
a cotton.
process, yeah.
And the child, you cannot ask them really how they feel in terms of stress and anxiety. So this is something that we can get us data that's unbiased, and this is what has not been available before. So all the studies that have been done so far have been by asking how the kids are feeling before an exam and during the exam, probably after the exam, and correlate that to how well they do or not. And so that's how the whole
Right.
So
Right.
where are you now at this process? I mean, I can understand clearly with children or the K-12 population, they're very young children, may not have the language to really be able to express how they're feeling. But something like this it would be a way to collect data and analyze it easily. But where are you now? You've conducted this study with college students, and
Well, the idea was to come up with a process
I see.
that we could then extend into K through 12 settings. Because there are particular challenges when you do this. I mean, there are questions around you're doing this with minors, what happens to the samples, how are you going to protect them, is it ethical? There are all sorts of questions that come because we're dealing with little kids. And so the main issue for me in discussing this with Mohammed and the other two faculty, Dr. Garib and Dr. Phillips, was actually to think about, well, how can we use this? What are the benefits of doing this? And my perception really was about the fact that many of the kids who are coming into, say, California classrooms or generally in public school classrooms, and in particular, I was very interested in finding out what are the stress levels for children and students of color when they come into educational contexts and educational settings, particularly if they are facing a tremendous amount of cross-cultural sort of border crossing, if you will. Because for a child coming into a classroom, it's literally like walking from one country into another
Exactly,
country.
yeah.
And the rules are different, the rules of engagement are different, the rules of behavior are different. What the teacher does and what the teacher expects and so on may be very different. And so all of this points to the fact that the classroom becomes sort of a cultural space which to begin with may be actually stress and anxiety ridden as it is. And so in that setting, how does learning occur? Where does the point at which learning becomes counterproductive? So what would be the optimal point at which the teacher kind of has to do something different and find a way to reduce the stress and anxiety that the kids might be feeling, even though they may not be taking an exam? Because that's the only means by which we kind of determine, okay, have you learned or not learned? So how can we in fact expand that possibility to think about what are other ways in which we can measure it? What are the other ways in which we can help children learn better and avoid the kinds of stress and anxiety that constantly puts them into fight or flight responses?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. Certainly the work that I've seen with different students who are doing their research projects
Sure.
in public schools, they're talking about informal ways that they can reduce anxiety and stress. Because people are recognizing, at least anecdotally to me and in their work, they're talking about just how overwrought children are. And teachers are trying to find informal ways to kind of reduce stress, whether it's breathing exercises or music or something like that. So what you're touching on, well, what you've examined is something on a much deeper level beyond what I've heard and read just by virtue of all of the work that's going on in schools, that this is really important information to kind of explore. What's going to happen next? What can we do next? What do we do? What have you done with the information that you found other than having a conversation with your colleagues?
Well, we're first trying to develop a process through which we can articulate how this particular set or pieces of information can be used. And in order to do that, we need to find a way to begin to collect some data with very clear protocols that have the interests of the children at heart. Largely because there is a certain level of stress and anxiety which actually contributes to learning, as Mohammed explained.
Exactly.
But the key element is to find out at what point that becomes counterproductive.
Exactly.
And so if let's say, for example, the time limit happens to be, say, 15 minutes or 20 minutes, that's at which point we want to stop and say, okay, let's do something else that then reduces the level of anxiety or stress, and then move on, which completely changes much of the periods of productive learning in how school is arranged and how class periods are arranged and how learning periods are arranged, so on and so forth. And we might actually end up being a lot more productive with that, is my hope. The other side of that equation is to really think about, everybody talks about how, for example, students of color may not be performing as well. And so my particular interest in that is in finding out, well, is this one of the variables that contributes? I mean, most people will probably say, well, that's not particularly an interesting question. We know that is the case. Well, I'm far more interested in finding out, well, let's actually look at some physiological evidence as opposed to, say, just speculating about it or asking certain things about it and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so to go back to the findings of the study we have done at the college level is that we found that there is a correlation between the level of cortisol we were measuring in the saliva of students and their psychological
self-report.
Yeah. And so while in the majority. Mm-hmm. So that means that we can, at the level of the K-12, we can trust the measurement of cortisol as what the kids are really feeling.
I see.
And we are not expecting to find any surprise. I think that we will confirm with at the biological level what psychology has shown before in terms of self-perceived report on stress. And so what we know as a hypothesis we're going to find is that, okay, there is anxiety that comes with the exam. Now, what that means is, in the classroom, are we testing learning or are we testing the ability of students to cope with stress?
Exactly, exactly.
And so if that's the case, we can either do without exams,
yes,
or one thing that the school could do is to actually get into teaching students how to cope with stress. And I'm happy to see that a lot of mindfulness exercises, yoga, meditation are being introduced at that level, because stress will be here. Stress, either at home or in the classroom, will always be part of our life. So it is actually great to have that part taught and the teachers aware about it and how to teach the kids to deal with it. This is particularly interesting and important for people of color and first generation of kids to go to school.
Which is what we're seeing, of course, now coming through the schools and especially at the college level.
This is the trend.
Right.
This is the new trend. And if you come from an impoverished background, usually you have to deal with other things. High rates of divorce, incarcerations of parents, domestic violence, street violence, as you are actually commuting to school, before even you deal with the exam anxiety.
So you come to school already with a high level of stress that's been part of your life.
Will be compounded to the exam stress itself, and so I don't know what we're testing.
That's right.
And is the conclusion that kids in violent communities are not learning. Maybe they are learning something, they just are not tested the right way.
Well,
And also that many of the kids who do come from these backgrounds of poverty, where race, class, all of those variables play a huge role, also come with a great degree of coping mechanisms. They have a lot of cultural resilience. They have a lot of skill in cultural adaptation because that's what they've been doing all the time.
So they've had to
and that's
learn.
not recognized
Yeah.
as, in fact, a valuable skill in the schools, where instead of using those as mechanisms to help their learning, we generally tend to not value them as much. Which in fact causes further anxiety and stress, which to me is a perfect opportunity, I would think, for both teachers and students to be able to find ways in which they can create learning contexts that take into account many of the strengths that they bring and help them use that to cope with the stress of being in a different cultural environment, such as a classroom.
Well, actually, it's amazing the information that you've brought and discussed today. We're out of time right now, but I certainly am hoping that we can continue this conversation, and I'm so delighted to have you both here to at least start this conversation and explain it as eloquently as you have. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be here, and I need to close now, reluctantly, but I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to thank the Buck Institute for Research on Aging for providing Seroptimus International of Novato with the opportunity to film in their facility. I'd also like to thank Leon Johnson, our studio engineer, and our crew members who are members of Seroptimus International of Novato for making this program possible. My name is Madalienne Peters. My guests are Suresh Appavoo and Mohammed Majdoubi. And thank you for listening. Thank you for being here.